Against the backdrop of an evening city, where the evening light is already beginning to fade, a tense conflict flares up. A young black woman named Jade returns home after a hard day at work, tired but determined. She walks down a deserted street when her attention is drawn to an approaching police patrol. The officer has long been known for his prejudice and racist attitudes, and today his anger is directed at Jade. He rudely and humiliatingly demands the girl's documents, not caring about her peace and safety. Jade tries to remain polite, but his aggression only increases. But at this moment something unexpected happens that radically changes the situation. The officer, who had been furious and self-righteous, suddenly became pale and confused. His face changed, and he was clearly stunned by what he had seen. What exactly had led to this turn of events? What unexpected moment had caused him to change his behavior? Write in the comments where you were watching us from and what do you think could have happened for the policeman to change so much. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you don't miss the continuation of the story. As soon as Jade looks up and sees the officer turn pale, her heart starts beating faster. Suddenly, a group of people with cameras appear from around the corner, filming the entire incident. One of them, a young woman with a determined expression, confidently approaches the policeman and begins to question his actions. There is tension in her voice, but also determination. This moment, with the camera capturing every gesture and every word, becomes decisive. The policeman, aware that his actions are now under close scrutiny, begins to stumble over his words. He tries to justify his behavior, but it soon becomes clear that his lies and bias can no longer remain hidden. With every word and movement, his confidence is fading, and he feels that his authority and reputation are under threat. Meanwhile, Jade, who has lived through this difficult moment, feels her fear begin to be replaced by pride. She understands that her resilience and courage have helped expose the hypocrisy of a system that is supposed to protect but often works against. The group recording everything on camera confirms her words and shows how the community can fight racism and police violence. Gradually, the situation turns into a discussion on social networks and in the news, where viewers from all over the world begin to understand the scale of the problem. The resonance of this incident raises questions about law enforcement reform and the importance of combating bias and injustice. Ultimately, this case becomes a symbol of the fight for equality and justice, reminding everyone that every action matters and that even in the darkest moments, sparks of hope and change can be found. As the group of people with cameras approached the policeman, he tried to keep his balance, but the tension was obvious. His face turned marble white, as if he had seen a ghost. A light breeze stirred the autumn leaves across the asphalt, and the evening air seemed pressurized. Jade stood nearby, clenching her fingers into fists, feeling her hands tremble with anger and fear. Every word the policeman uttered sounded less convincing. He had slyly spoken about conducting a security check, but now that the bright lights of the cameras were shining on him, his words lost their power. Jade's gaze slid to the group of onlookers. They had witnessed the scene and were beginning to gather around. Their eyes were filled with horror and sympathy. Their presence was not only support for Jade, but also a signal that this incident would not go unnoticed. One of them, a young woman named Laura, who had experienced fighting racism and police violence, approached Jade and gently offered to help. Laura knew that incidents like this could often be hushed up or quickly forgotten. Using her camera, she began recording every word and action the officer said. "We need to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," she told Jade, her voice full of determination. The policeman, realizing that it was now almost impossible to hide the truth, began to slowly back away from Jade. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable until this moment, began to crack at the seams. More police cars began to arrive, and soon the scene was surrounded by law enforcement officials. When the senior officers arrived, the cop who had started the whole thing looked even more confused and nervous. One of the new officers, a staff sergeant familiar with his colleague's reputation, was clearly stunned by what he saw. Jade's heart began to pound as she saw the staff sergeant exchange glances with the cop who had been following her. Those glances conveyed not just words, but a long history of systemic racism and bias. In the interrogation that followed, Jade and her witnesses gave their evidence. The policeman, straining his voice and trying to maintain an outward calm, defended his actions. but his arguments were easily refuted by the recordings and testimony. As Jade sat in the police station, awaiting the outcome of her case, she felt her fears slowly dissipate. She understood that her encounter with systemic injustice was now part of a larger narrative. Her determination and courage that day became a symbol of resistance against racism and injustice. Jade's story quickly spread across social media and news platforms. People began discussing her case, drawing parallels with other incidents of racist violence and demanding changes in law enforcement policies and practices. Protests soon followed, drawing attention to the larger issue of systemic racism and police brutality. Slowly but surely, public opinion began to put pressure on the government for reform and transparency. Jade became the face of this movement, symbolizing both the personal struggle and the collective effort to fight for justice. She understood that her story was only the beginning, and that real change requires hard work and ongoing struggle. Thus, her experience became a starting point for public dialogue and change that could lead to a more just and equal society, where no one would be afraid of becoming a victim of racist prejudice and police brutality. As discussions and protests around Jade's case began to gain popularity, the case began to take on wider dimensions. Activists, journalists, and even human rights groups began demanding a more thorough investigation and explanation. The police officer whose actions led to the crisis was suspended, but many doubted that this would be enough to solve the problem. Journalists began digging into his past, uncovering more evidence of his bias and brutality. Meanwhile, Jade and her lawyers began working on a lawsuit against the officer and law enforcement, seeking not only justice for her, but also systemic change. Every public appearance she made, every interview she gave, became a voice for those who also suffered from racist violence and police brutality. As a result, more and more people from all walks of life began to unite in support of change. These efforts began to bear fruit. Several cities began to pass new laws and reforms aimed at ensuring greater transparency in policing and preventing bias. Some places created independent commissions to investigate complaints against police officers and improve training procedures for law enforcement officers. During this time, Jade continued her life, but her daily activities were invariably colored by the events she had experienced. Although her fight was far from over, she felt supported by the community and understood that her personal experience had become a catalyst for wider change. However, not all changes were easy or conflict-free. Some police officers and their allies resisted the reforms, trying to preserve old practices and maintain the status quo. This led to new protests and clashes, which forced the public to come together again and continue the fight. Jade, despite all the difficulties, continued to be an activist and a speaker. She was inspired by the support and visible changes that were happening thanks to the efforts of people like her. She began working to create a fund for victims of racism and police violence, aiming to provide resources and support to those facing similar challenges. Her story was soon immortalized in a documentary film that became not only a testament to her struggle, but also a powerful tool for education and awareness of systemic racism and police violence. The film generated a lot of interest and helped many people understand the complexity and depth of the problem. Gradually, public sentiment began to change. Reforms adopted at the local and federal levels began to show initial positive results. The level of police violence decreased, and more people began to believe in the possibility of change. Jade knew that her path was far from easy, but she also knew that her efforts were not in vain. She continued to work to improve the system and train young activists, passing on to them the knowledge and experience she had gained in her struggle. Her personal story has become a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, it is possible to find light and hope. And while there is still much to be done, her legacy continues to inspire those fighting for justice and equality in society. Over time, Jade's case attracted the attention of not only the public, but also those willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain the status quo. As Jade became a more visible figure in the fight for truth and justice, her life began to face new dangers. Her efforts to reform law enforcement angered some groups who saw these changes as a threat to their position and privilege. One day, when Jade was returning home after a meeting with lawyers, her car was surrounded by a group of unknown people. These people, dressed in dark clothes and with masks on their faces, began to intimidate her, shouting insults and threats. Jade, filled with fear, managed to escape, but on her shoulders now lay not only the burden of fighting for justice, but also a real threat to her life. Soon after, tragic events began to unfold around her. One of her closest allies and activists, Alex, who had helped her campaign, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The investigation by local authorities was inconclusive, and many believed his death was a direct result of his activism against racism and police violence. The tragedy deeply shook Jade and her fellow activists, leaving them with a sense of uncertainty and confusion. The loss was a huge blow to Jade. Alex was not only a friend, but also an important part of her campaign. His death became a symbol of the dangers faced by those who fight against the system, and it put her own safety at risk. She began a series of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. She knew her work mattered, but the cost of that work had become too high. Despite her deep sadness, Jade chose to continue the fight. She participated in numerous events and protests to honor Alex and other victims of racism. These events became a place not only to show solidarity, but also to realize that change requires not only effort, but also the willingness to face enormous challenges. Meanwhile, tensions in society were growing. Protests and rallies in support of reforms were becoming more widespread, but also more conflictual. In some cases, clashes between protesters and law enforcement reached dangerous levels. Jade, participating in such events, faced aggression from both police officers and counter-protesters. The situation came to a head when more clashes occurred in her hometown. One of them, during a peaceful protest, turned violent, resulting in several deaths and numerous injuries. Jade, being on the front lines, narrowly escaped injury, but the event left deep scars on her, both physically and emotionally. Despite these tragedies and dangers, Jade continued her work. She began to actively advocate for the creation of a national memorial to the victims of racism and police violence, ensuring that their names and stories would never be forgotten. This project became her new focus and helped her continue her work despite the difficulties. Over time, Jade was able to overcome the horror of loss and fear, transforming her personal tragedies into motivation for continued efforts. She continued to inspire many with her courage and perseverance, and her name became a symbol that even in the darkest and most dangerous moments, one can find strength and hope to fight for a better future. Her work ultimately led to important reforms, and her personal efforts helped strengthen the movement for justice and equality. And while the cost of this fight was high, Jade knew that her actions and sacrifices were part of a larger change that could save lives and bring justice to many generations to come. With each passing day, Jade became more and more involved in her work to reform law enforcement and create a memorial to the victims of racism. Despite personal losses and constant threats, her determination never wavered, but it was at this point that her life and work took the most unexpected and shocking turn. One autumn evening, as Jade was returning home from yet another meeting with her lawyers, her path crossed with a man who was clearly waiting for her at her entrance. This man looked like an ordinary passerby, but his gaze was focused and wary. Jade felt her heart beat faster and carefully approached him. "Are you Jade?" he asked, and there was something strange in his voice that made her wary. "Yes, I am," she answered, straining. "What do you want?" The man introduced himself as Richard Hopkins, a recently retired police officer. He told Jade that he had information that could change her understanding of what was happening. Richard explained that his career had involved the same departments and colleagues involved in the recent incidents, and he had learned about a system that supported racist practices from within. He said that in recent years, a hidden network had existed in some police districts in which racist police officers and corrupt officials exchanged information and coordinated their actions to suppress activists and avoid punishment. Richard claimed that he had documents and evidence that could have supported his claims, but he had been forced into hiding due to threats from his former colleagues. Jade was stunned, but also intrigued. She knew that such information could be the key to her fight for justice, but the dangers associated with it were obvious. They agreed to meet in a safe place the next day to discuss details and examine the evidence. When Jade and Richard met at the appointed place, He handed her a folder of documents and digital files. Inside was evidence that confirmed the existence of covert operations involving high-ranking police officers and government officials. The evidence showed how the network manipulated investigations and bribed witnesses to cover up crimes and maintain racist practices. As Jade studied the materials, she was shocked by how thoroughly the network operated. However, her relief quickly turned to alarm when she discovered in one of the documents that her name was listed as a threat element. This meant that her life was in even greater danger than she thought. The unknown persons behind the threats and harassment of Jade began to take action. One night, her apartment was burglarized and important documents and equipment containing key evidence were stolen. Jade felt that she and Richard might be followed and their safety was at risk. Meanwhile, Richard, realizing that his past could put him at even greater risk, decided to leave town and go into hiding. Jade, determined to go further, began working with a team of trusted allies to secure and verify the documents while they were in her hands. She passed key information to journalists and human rights organizations, who launched a national investigation. But the culmination of this tense period was that the existence of the secret network and its activities became the subject of widespread public debate. Initially skeptical of Jade, the media and the public were now stunned by the scale and gravity of the revelations. National authorities soon launched a major investigation, involving federal agencies and independent commissions. In the midst of the crisis, Jade received an unexpected call. It was an anonymous source who informed her that additional evidence had been discovered in government archives indicating that someone in high positions may have been involved in organizing and maintaining the network. This new evidence provided final confirmation to many suspicions, and soon an open investigation was launched against those behind the system. Despite all the obstacles and dangers, Jade remained determined. She continued her work, helping to rally public forces to support reform and demand accountability for those involved in corruption and violence. Her courage and resilience made her a symbol of the fight for justice, and her story inspired many to take action against systemic injustice. Jade knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew that her actions and efforts, supported by public support and new evidence, had made a real difference. She was prepared to continue her work despite the risks, and her resolve remained unwavering. As public pressure mounted and the investigation gained high-level attention, Jade knew her work was becoming an important part of a broader movement to change the system. But despite new evidence and the beginnings of reform, the real fight for racial justice was far from over. After the network was uncovered and additional evidence was obtained, government and law enforcement agencies began conducting comprehensive investigations across the country. As a result, serious violations were found in various police departments and government agencies, confirming the long-term systemic problem of racism. One of the key findings was that the racist network operated not only within local law enforcement, but also at higher levels of government, including politicians who used their power to undermine reform efforts and uphold racist policies. These high-level figures were involved in creating false charges against activists and even organizing raids against those fighting for human rights. Jade was instrumental in building a coalition of activists, human rights defenders, and lawyers to use new data to raise the issue of racism at a higher level. This coalition began lobbying for new laws aimed at creating a more transparent justice system and preventing corruption. She also worked to strengthen educational programs in schools and universities to raise awareness of racism and teach young people how to combat bias. Through these efforts, Jade has witnessed unimaginable changes. For example, she was a leading figure in the creation of the National Center for the Study of Race, which aimed to analyze bias and identify ways to combat it at all levels of society. The center also provided support to victims of racism, providing them with resources and assistance. However, every achievement had its price. Jade continued to face threats and pressure from those who wanted to maintain the old order. In some cases, her personal achievements became the target of attacks and attempts to discredit her. Protests and accusations from those who did not want change became part of her daily life. One of the most shocking moments came when Jade discovered that her own phone calls and emails had been intercepted and used against her, further proof of how deeply ingrained the system of bias is and how far those who seek to maintain it will go. In the midst of these events, Jade also began to receive support from unexpected places. Individual officers who were not involved in the corruption schemes began to reach out to support her work and provide information about instances of bias and abuse. These officers were risking their careers to try to change the system from within. In one of her most significant moments, Jade spoke at a human rights conference, where her speech about systemic racism and the need for reform caused a storm of emotions. Her words were not only a call to action, but also a signal to politicians and the public that decisive action must be taken to create a just society. In parallel, Jade and her allies began a campaign to reopen old cases of police abuse and racism, seeking resentencing and compensation for those wrongfully convicted. These efforts have led to many people convicted on the basis of false charges and racial biases beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel and hope for justice. Jade's story continued to evolve, becoming a symbol of the fight for equality and justice in the country. She understood that her work was only the beginning, and that change required constant effort and sustained public pressure. In her life, despite all the difficulties, there remained a sincere hope that the future would be more fair and equal. Every victory and every challenge only strengthened her resolve to continue the fight. Jade understood that real change begins with the actions of each individual, and that her personal story was part of a larger movement for rights and equality. And although she knew the road would be long and difficult, she was ready to go all the way to create a world where racism and injustice would not have a place. From the moment Jade decided to fight for reform and justice, her life plunged into dark and dangerous waters, full of conflict and personal sacrifice. As her work became more visible and influential, Jade's life became more stressful and dangerous. Despite her successes and progress in her investigations, the racist network she was trying to expose was not going down without a fight. In an attempt to maintain its influence, the network began to increasingly attack Jade and her allies. One day, during an important press conference where Jade planned to present new evidence and testimony about systemic racism, a terrible tragedy occurred. In the middle of her speech, an explosion was heard in the hall. Instant panic and chaos engulfed everyone present. Jade was caught in the center of the blast wave, her body thrown several meters from the stage. When she came to, her surroundings were destroyed and many people were hurt. Jade barely understood that her life had been saved, but the severe injuries and shock left her in critical condition. This attack was not just a physical assault, but an attempt to suppress her work and ensure her activism. The hospital she was taken to became the place where she spent weeks recovering. Her condition was stable, but every day was filled with physical and emotional pain. The doctor's prognosis was bleak, recovery would take a long time, and Jade faced the real possibility that she would not be able to return to her previous level of activity. At this point, her activists and allies took over her work. They continued her work, but they also faced a new wave of attacks and pressure from those who did not want change. The situation worsened, resulting in new protests, clashes, and even pogroms. These events clearly showed how much the system resists change and how many people are willing to go to extreme measures to maintain the status quo. While Jade was recovering, another tragedy occurred in her personal life. Jade's mother, who had always supported her, suddenly fell seriously ill and died shortly after. This loss was a huge blow to Jade. The grief of losing a loved one was superimposed on her physical suffering and disappointment that her work had been stopped. When Jade was able to return to her work, she found her struggles even more difficult. She was forced to adapt her methods and find new ways to continue her mission. However, her personal losses and experiences made her more determined, and she became a symbol of resilience and courage. Unusual support came from unexpected sources. Sometime later, a former high-profile police officer who was a key member of the racist network decided to cooperate with the authorities. He, realizing the consequences of his actions and feeling guilty, decided to reveal all the details of his activities and provide important evidence. His confession played a decisive role in further investigations and bringing other members of the network to justice. However, even with these new revelations, systemic racism and bias did not immediately disappear. Jade continued to work to improve legislation and expand educational programs aimed at raising awareness of racism and bias. There were still tragedies and hardships in her life, but she understood that her efforts were part of a larger fight for justice. Her stories and struggles became an example for many, inspiring people to not give up in the face of injustice. Jade knew that even through all the tragedy and suffering, her work was important and necessary. She continued to strive for a world where equality and justice were not just ideas, but a reality for every person. Jade's story was one of sacrifice and struggle, but it also symbolized resilience and hope. Her quest for justice and equality, despite tragic loss and danger, left a deep mark on the history of human rights, showing that even in the darkest times, light can be found in the strength to continue the fight for a better future. After returning to active life, Jade faced a new challenge that was even more difficult and dangerous than anything she had experienced before. Soon after her recovery, Jade noticed that her actions were beginning to cause growing discontent in high places. This discontent manifested itself not only in the form of new threats and harassment, but also in the form of organized campaigns to discredit her work and her person. In an attempt to suppress her activism, opponents began to use the media to spread false information and create an image of Jade as a radical and dangerous figure. At the same time, the growing wave of violence and protests has left many of her supporters under threat. One of her closest aides and friend, Martin, was brutally beaten in a targeted attack aimed at suppressing his work and intimidating other activists. The attack left him severely injured and in hospital with his life hanging in the balance. Martin's tragedy and the constant threats have forced Jade to consider the safety of her allies and the lengths to which those who wish to preserve the existing order will go. These events have strengthened her resolve to fight to the end, but also led to a deeper understanding that her actions can affect not only herself, but the lives of those around her. While Jade struggled to stay active and continue her work, her personal life became even more challenging. As a result of the stress and pressure of her job, her health deteriorated again and she had to make serious medical decisions. This period became one of the most difficult in her life, as every day was a fight for survival, both physically and emotionally. But the biggest blow came when Jade received news that her foundation for victims of racism and police violence had been attacked. Unknown assailants had destroyed the building and stolen documents and data, jeopardizing the foundation's operations and ability to provide assistance to those in need. Jade and her team were forced to quickly rethink their strategy and rebuild the foundation in the face of growing threats and a lack of resources. Yet, amidst all these hardships and tragedies, Jade continued to be an inspiration to many. Her resilience and determination in overcoming adversity attracted the attention of the international community. Seeing her struggles and sacrifices, international organizations began to provide support and resources for her work, allowing her to continue her efforts and expand her impact. But in one of her darkest moments, Jade was once again faced with an unexpected twist. In one of her meetings with high-profile lawyers and human rights activists, she was presented with a new witness, a man who claimed to have been part of the network she was trying to expose, but now wanted to help her with her work. This witness, a former assistant to one of the corrupt officials, had information about a hidden plan to destroy all evidence and suppress movements for justice. The information provided by this witness was shocking. It revealed a plan to create false charges and stage crimes to deflect attention from real abuses and discredit anyone fighting for the truth. These plans also included using private security companies to spy on and harass activists. Realizing that this information could change the course of events, Jade began to prepare a response with her allies and international partners. They worked to expose the plan and prevent it from being carried out. Meanwhile, Jade continued to fight for reform and rights, but also became more cautious and strategic in order to protect herself and her allies. Despite all the trials and tragedies, Jade continued to fight. Her story became not only a testament to strength and courage, but also a reminder that even in the darkest times, one can find a path to light and change. She understood that her efforts were part of a global fight for justice, and her determination and tenacity inspired many to continue fighting for a world free of racism and prejudice. Every victory and every step forward, despite the sacrifices and difficulties, was important to Jade. She knew that her work would continue until the world became a place where everyone was equal, and her story would serve as an example for all who strive for justice and equality. After a series of attacks and tragedies, despite being exhausted and losing loved ones, Jade never gave up on her mission. Her determination to fight for justice and confront the racist system remained unwavering, but her work soon led to an unexpected and shocking turn of events. One day, as Jade was preparing for an important meeting with international human rights activists, she received an anonymous message asking her to meet in a secluded location. The message contained information about a large gathering of influential people involved in a racist network that was to take place in a closed club in the city center. The meeting allegedly involved several key politicians, police officers, and businessmen who were secretly discussing how to further consolidate their power and eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their plans. Realizing the importance of the information, Jade decided to act quickly. She contacted several trusted allies and they began planning an operation to breach the meeting. They set up recording cameras to gather irrefutable evidence of high-profile individuals involved in racist schemes and corruption. However, when Jade and her team went undercover to infiltrate the meeting, they were faced with an unexpected situation. Not only were the aforementioned individuals present, but also several new players who looked even more powerful and dangerous. The discussion was not only about maintaining the existing order, but also about a plan to incite racial hatred in order to distract attention from the real crimes and strengthen their power. The secret meeting came as a shock to Jade. During the discussion, she heard about plans to create fake events and provocations that would lead to violent clashes between different ethnic groups. This strategy was designed to discredit the justice movement and distract the public from the real abuses. In the midst of the shocking revelation, another tragic event occurred. One of her closest allies and informant, Richard Hopkins, who had previously provided Jade with vital information about the racist network, was found dead under strange circumstances. The official version was that it was suicide, but Jade was certain that it was a murder aimed at suppressing important information. In response to these tragedies and threats, Jade decided to take decisive action. She and her team did everything they could to ensure that information about the meeting and the plans of the racist network was exposed. They passed evidence to international human rights organizations and media outlets, and soon the information became headline news. Soon after the disclosure of these data, a massive campaign to expose and punish those responsible began. National and international investigative bodies launched extensive investigations. Public outrage and protests reached their peak, and many of the high-profile participants in the meeting were under investigation. But, as often happens in such situations, the threat returned to Jade. Her life was again under threat, and she was forced to take additional security measures. Accompanied by security, she continued to actively speak at rallies and conferences, calling for the continuation of the fight for truth and justice. An unexpected turn of events occurred when one of Jade's main opponents, a powerful politician who had previously been among those planning violence and racial provocations, decided to contact and cooperate with the authorities. His decision was dictated by the fear of possible exposure and loss of his own influence. He agreed to provide information about even larger plans and schemes that had not yet been revealed. This new evidence confirmed the existence of an international network that coordinated the actions of racist groups around the world. Jade learned that the system she was fighting against was part of a larger, more complex scheme that spanned multiple countries and governments. These revelations led to a global investigation involving human rights organizations, international courts, and federal agencies. International trials began to look into racist crimes and human rights violations. This investigation was a significant step toward rooting out the global network of racism and corruption. Jade's situation was tragic and dangerous, but her determination and courage led to significant change. Her efforts became part of a global movement for equality and justice, and her story inspired many to continue fighting for a world without racism and prejudice. Despite all the challenges, Jade continued her work. Her life was filled with struggle, sacrifice, and hardship, but she knew that her actions had changed the world for the better. She left a legacy of fighting for human rights and equality that will inspire future generations to continue her legacy. After exposing an international network of racism and corruption, Jade felt she had reached a major milestone in her fight for justice. However, life dealt her another blow that called all her efforts and plans into question. Shortly after the international investigations began to bear fruit, Jade received an anonymous tip that her previous revelations might be part of an even larger plan. The tip claimed that certain high-profile figures who had seemingly been exposed and punished actually had hidden connections and continued to run shadowy operations. Despite her best efforts to keep herself safe, Jade found her life and work at even greater risk. Just before she was scheduled to present her new findings at an international human rights conference, she discovered that her office had been destroyed, her documents destroyed, and her computers and data stolen. With little evidence left, her team was in a bind. At the same time, Jade learned of new threats and attempts on her life. Her homes and offices were subject to constant attacks and surveillance. These events were accompanied, among other things, by the publication of false news that Jade had allegedly accepted bribes and become part of a corruption scheme. These news stories, spread from false sources, were intended to undermine her reputation and discredit her work. It was later revealed that these attacks were part of a carefully planned plot to prevent Jade and her team from solving larger crimes. The plot involved manipulating media, financial flows, and political influence. Her former allies, many of whom were also under threat, began to face new challenges and attacks. The tragedy reached its climax when Jade learned of the violent death of one of her key allies, Lillian, who was collecting and analyzing data on the racist network. Lillian was found dead under strange circumstances, and the official version again spoke of suicide, but Jade was certain it was murder. Jade's dark days became even more cloudy when her own health deteriorated again due to constant stress and pressure. Doctors informed her that her condition had become critical and she would need long-term treatment and recovery. However, Jade could not afford to give up. She continued to work even under increasing pressure and threats. At that moment, she received an unexpected offer from an unknown source who claimed to be able to provide her with key evidence about the covert operations and plans of the racist network. The source was willing to cooperate only on the condition of complete anonymity and security. The new evidence provided by this source included recordings of secret meetings, financial transactions, and patterns linking various high-profile individuals and organizations. Jade realized that this information could lead to the revelation of the true extent of the conspiracy and the closure of the investigation. She worked to prepare materials for presentation to international courts and human rights organizations. But before she could make her announcement, another unexpected turn occurred. On the day Jade planned to publicly present the data, her conference was attacked by a group of armed men. The attack, while not causing many casualties, derailed plans to release the information and led to a new round of violence and threats. At this critical moment, Jade received an unexpected offer of cooperation from an influential human rights activist who had access to international judicial bodies and resources. This human rights activist proposed the creation of a special international commission to investigate all the facts revealed and ensure transparency in the fight against racism and corruption. The creation of the commission was an important step in building international support and pressure on governments and corporations. Jade and her team joined forces with international organizations to continue the fight on a global level. Despite all the difficulties and tragedies, her work began to bear fruit, and her efforts became part of a larger movement for global change. Jade realized that her fight had become a symbol of the global fight for human rights and justice. Although her personal sacrifices were great, she knew that her efforts were not in vain. More and more people found support in her fight for equality and justice, and her story became an inspiration for those who strive to change the world for the better. Jade's story continued to evolve, becoming part of a greater epic struggle against racism and injustice. Her determination and courage, despite all the tragedies and trials, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit and hope for a better future. After an international commission was formed to investigate the racist network, Jade and her team dove into the work of exposing the vast schemes of racism and corruption, but their efforts were met with even greater tragedy and hardship. Shortly after, Jade discovered that her efforts to expose the network of racism had led to a new wave of attacks and sabotage. Each new exposure only served to intensify the aggression of those trying to maintain power and control. Many of her allies were threatened, attacked, and their lives were at risk. One day, after an attack on Jade's office, her team discovered that important documents and evidence had been destroyed. As a result of this attack, several members of her team were seriously injured. These events were not just a physical attack, but also a psychological blow that made Jade doubt that she could complete her work. But the real tragedy occurred when a group of protesters who supported Jade's efforts became victims of a violent attack during one of the peaceful rallies organized in support of reform. A radical group with ties to racist and nationalist organizations carried out a brutal attack. The attack resulted in the death of many people and many more were seriously injured. The tragedy was a shocking reminder of the lengths to which those who seek to uphold racist ideology and order will go. Jade was deeply affected by the loss, and her own health deteriorated again due to the constant stress and grief. The situation became even more complicated when Jade learned that her close friends and associates were systematically attacked and threatened. Her family, who had always supported her, became the target of attacks by those who wanted to destroy her morale. They received threats and even became victims of attacks, which added another dramatic note to her struggle. The tragedy reached its climax when, in one of its darkest turns, Jade received information about a racist network's plans to create new forms of discrimination and oppression. Racist groups were developing a strategy to destroy the education system in disadvantaged areas in order to deny young people access to knowledge and opportunity, thereby perpetuating social inequality and racism in the future. These plans became the new focus for Jade and her team. They began working to expose these schemes and prevent them from being carried out. But the fight proved even more difficult as the racist networks used increasingly sophisticated methods to hide their activities. Jade and her allies faced constant threats and attacks that tried to break their will. During this dark moment, Jade received vital information from an anonymous source who was involved in one of the racist groups. This source revealed a major conspiracy that was being prepared, which was to be the culmination of years of efforts by racist groups to consolidate their power. The plans included not only new forms of discrimination, but also the manipulation of elections and political structures in order to control legislative bodies and continue their activities without restrictions. Jade realized that her work and the work of the International Commission were under threat. Her team and allies continued to work to uncover new evidence despite constant threats and attacks. Jade herself took part in exposing the plans, taking every precaution to protect herself and her loved ones. Her efforts have led to large-scale investigations and prosecutions not only at the national level but also at the international level. However, despite all efforts, the fight against racism and corruption has proven more difficult than ever. Her work uncovered many new facts and patterns that showed how deeply racism and corruption had permeated various areas of society. But each revelation was accompanied by new victims and tragedies. Jade continued her fight despite increasing difficulties and personal losses, realizing that her work was part of a never-ending fight for justice. The story of Jade and her team is a testament not only to fortitude and determination, but also to the tragic reality of how difficult it is to combat deep-rooted racism and corruption. Her efforts brought about many changes, but also many victims. Nevertheless, her work has left an indelible mark on the history of the fight for human rights and justice. Despite the relentless efforts of Jade and her team, the fight against racism and corruption was far from over. Personal and societal pressure continued to mount, and every step forward seemed to bring greater challenges. After the International Commission released new evidence, things began to take an unexpected turn. The plans of racist groups to manipulate and discriminate were exposed, but instead of leading to peace and justice, this triggered a wave of even more violent reactions. Amid mounting public pressure and political changes, racist groups became even more aggressive and desperate in their attempts to maintain power. Jade received information that her life was once again under serious threat. She and her team were targeted by radical groups using increasingly sophisticated and dangerous methods. Her home and office were again targeted, and her team faced new forms of harassment and blackmail. One day, when Jade was planning an important public appearance in which she was going to present key evidence about ongoing patterns of discrimination and manipulation, her team discovered that all the materials had been stolen from their archives. This data, containing important evidence that could lead to the punishment of the perpetrators, was gone. Jade was shocked and disappointed, realizing that this could jeopardize all her efforts and plans. In this moment of crisis, Jade also faced a tragic loss. Her senior colleague and close friend, Aaron, who was an integral part of her team, was killed in a targeted attack. Aaron was a vital part of the data collection and analysis work, and his death was a huge blow to Jade and her entire team. Aaron was killed on his way home from a long day of work, and his murder was intended to crush morale and create fear among those who continue to fight for justice. The losses and tragedies led to an internal crisis within Jade's team. Some members began to express doubts about continuing the fight, while others felt increasing pressure and fear for their own safety. However, Jade remained determined, knowing that her work was essential to changing the system and combating racism. To make matters worse, despite the threats and data loss, Jade and her team were informed of a new, more sinister plan. Racist groups began to strategize about undermining social and educational programs that help and support minorities. They were trying to create a new generation that would be deprived of the ability to think critically and understand their own worth. During this difficult time, Jade was faced with a choice: continue to fight, risking even more losses, or try to find a way to keep her team safe and continue working in the face of this new threat. She decided that she could not retreat, and focused all her energy on preventing further destruction and discrimination. To do this, she began collaborating with international organizations, activists, and human rights defenders to create a powerful alliance that could counter threats and continue to expose racist schemes. Together, they developed a plan to protect educational programs and social initiatives aimed at supporting those under threat. Despite the challenges and tragedies, Jade continued to find strength and courage in her mission. She and her allies worked to shine a light on the truth and create a support system for those who had suffered from racism and discrimination. Each step forward came with sacrifice and difficulty, but Jade knew that her work was necessary to create a more just and equal world. Jade's story has become not only a testament to her personal struggle, but also an inspiration to others who seek to change society. Her determination and courage, despite all the trials and losses, have become a symbol of hope and the strength of the human spirit. Her story reflects all the tragedies and triumphs that come with the fight for justice, and she has continued to move forward, confident that her efforts will have a lasting impact on the future. After a devastating loss and constant threat, Jade continued her fight against racism despite mounting pressure and challenges. She and her team worked to prevent the destruction of educational programs and social initiatives that supported less privileged groups. During this time, their work attracted the attention of international human rights organizations and the media, giving them new opportunities for action and attracting public support. But an unexpected turn of events changed the situation. Jade received a mysterious message from an unknown source who claimed to have secret information that could not only expose the roots of the racist network, but also provide evidence of a high-level conspiracy involving world leaders and financial elites. The message hinted that the secret materials were in an ancient archive linked to the history of corrupt elites, and that they could only be accessed through a complex maze of deceptions and setups. The message also spoke of a mysterious event that was to take place in the coming days, a closed meeting in a remote castle to discuss global strategies that would have profound implications for the future. Jade was determined. Despite warnings from her team and close friends about the potential dangers, she decided to investigate this information. She gathered a small group of trusted allies and traveled to the supposed meeting place. After careful preparation and disguise, they infiltrated the castle, using deception and clever tricks to bypass the guards. The castle was immersed in an atmosphere of mystery and wealth, hiding secrets that could affect the future. Jade and her team discovered that the gathering included not only representatives of racist groups, but also high-profile world leaders, major financiers, and influential businessmen who seemed to play neutral or even supportive roles. During the meeting, Jade and her team were able to access classified documents and records. They discovered that there was, in fact, a secret organization that was aiming to create a new world order through manipulation and control. This organization was working to develop technologies for mass surveillance, manipulation of public opinion, and oppression of certain groups. It turned out that the racist network was just part of their larger strategy. However, the most shocking revelation came when Jade came across a document revealing that many of the most prominent human rights activists and public figures who had previously supported her efforts were in fact affiliated with this secret organization. This betrayal shocked her to the core, as these individuals had used their influence to manipulate public opinion and protect the interests of high-profile criminals. In the midst of this discovery, Jade and her team found themselves in a dangerous situation. The castle was surrounded by guards, and their presence was soon discovered. The team members were forced to flee, leaving behind documents that could be used for further exposure. In the midst of this, Jade faced another tragic turn of events. One of her trusted allies was captured by guards and detained. This ally, Michael, was a vital member of the team and had key information about the secret organization's plans. Realizing that his life was in danger, Jade tried to find a way to free him and return the data. She organized a complex operation to save Michael, using all her resources and connections. This process was extremely dangerous and required significant effort and sacrifice, but Michael was eventually freed. Immediately after his release, Michael provided important additional information about the inner workings of the secret organization and their plans. This information became the basis for a new wave of revelations and trials. Despite all the difficulties and dangers, Jade and her team continued to work on uncovering a massive conspiracy. At the same time, Jade faced growing opposition and betrayal from those who seemed to be her allies. The situation worsened when some of her closest associates began to act suspiciously, and it became clear that there may be spies or traitors among them, working for a secret organization. This crisis forced Jade to rethink her strategies and tighten her security measures. She began working on a new alliance with unbiased human rights groups and independent journalists to prevent further manipulation and expose the truth. At the same time, Jade realized that her personal safety and the safety of her team became the most important priorities. Gradually, thanks to the efforts of Jade and her new alliance, significant progress was made in uncovering the conspiracy and bringing those responsible to justice. The international community began to take action against the secret organization, and the real fight for a more just and transparent world began. Despite all the difficulties and tragedies, Jade remained true to her mission. Her fight was not in vain, and her efforts led to important changes and increased awareness of global threats and racist schemes. Jade's story became an inspiration for future generations, demonstrating how determination and courage can fight the darkest forces. After Jade and her team made significant progress in uncovering a global conspiracy, they were faced with new challenges. The secret organization that was revealed not only had vast resources, but was also incredibly sophisticated in its methods of protection and manipulation. The discovery of vital information led to even more tension and danger for Jade and her allies. Shortly after the conspiracy was revealed, a campaign of disinformation and smears against Jade began. A secret organization with access to cutting-edge technology and media resources launched a comprehensive operation to discredit Jade and her team. False accusations, false evidence, and manipulation of public opinion created darkness and confusion around her work. As a result of this campaign, public sentiment began to shift. Previously supportive groups began to question her actions, and some important allies began to withdraw their cooperation. Jade and her team found themselves under threat from both the public and those who seemed to be their allies. At this time, Jade received an unexpected offer from an unknown source. This source offered her access to a unique technology that could help solve many of the remaining mysteries. The technology was a sophisticated cryptographic analysis system that could decipher encrypted messages and reveal hidden communications between members of a secret organization. Jade decided to take a chance and use this technology. Together with a few trusted team members, she began working on deciphering hidden messages. The work was difficult and time-consuming, but they soon discovered that the secret organization was using complex codes and encodings to hide its true plans and the identities of its members. The key revelation was that the secret organization was planning a global event that would dramatically change the political landscape and strengthen their power on the international stage. This event was scheduled for the coming weeks and involved mass manipulation of public opinion, economic structures, and political systems. Jade and her team realized they had to act quickly to prevent this from happening. They began preparing to expose the plan internationally, but soon faced another tragedy. One of the key members of the team, Leah, was kidnapped and held in conditions that threatened her life. Leah was an expert in cryptography and played a key role in deciphering the messages. Realizing that Leah could be killed if the secret organization discovered that her work had exposed their plans, Jade orchestrated a complex rescue operation. The rescue mission involved not only physically entering the holding facility, but also operating under cover of darkness and deceiving highly effective security. During the rescue operation, Jade and her team faced many challenges and threats, but they were able to successfully free Leah. Leah was in shock and stress after her return, but her knowledge of the secret organization's plans proved invaluable. Thanks to her help, Jade and her team were able to finally decipher key details of the upcoming global event. It was revealed that the secret organization planned to trigger a series of events that would cause global social and economic crises. These crises were designed to create chaos and fear that would allow the organization to consolidate its influence and control. One of the most shocking elements of the plan was the use of technology to manipulate markets and create artificial conflicts. At the last minute, Jade and her allies were able to gather the necessary evidence and make it available to the international community. This information caused an international scandal and led to the beginning of global investigations. World leaders, politicians, and organizations began to act to prevent the looming crises and expose the crimes of the secret organization. Although the fight was far from over and Jade continued to face challenges and threats, her work led to significant changes in international politics and security. She became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice, and her efforts helped create a more open and just society. Jade's story ended on a positive note. Despite all the trials, her work and sacrifices paid off, and she was able to see the fruits of her struggle. The secret organization was exposed, and the international community began to take steps to create a fairer and safer world. Jade's story became an inspiration to many, demonstrating how determination and courage can change the world, even in the most difficult and tragic circumstances. Her legacy lives on, inspiring future generations to fight for truth and justice. With the successful exposure of a global conspiracy, Jade and her team thought their work was nearly done. They began to receive international recognition and support for their efforts to fight corruption and racism. However, as it turned out, this was only the beginning of a new phase of their fight. While the world community was preoccupied with dismantling the plans of the secret organization and eliminating their influence, Jade and her team continued to monitor the remaining members of the group and prevent potential threats. They received new information that another secret structure, supposedly not directly connected to the secret organization, was preparing for a global event. Jade soon learned of a mysterious project that involved technological innovation and could have a significant impact on public opinion. Codenamed the Astral Project, the project involved using advanced virtual reality technology to manipulate mass consciousness. Jade and her team began investigating to see how this project could be connected to their previous revelations. During her investigation, Jade discovered that the Astral Project was not just a technological experiment, but part of a more complex plan. It turned out that the project was designed to create virtual realities in which people could be manipulated and controlled on an emotional and perceptual level. The goal was to subjugate the consciousness of the masses and force them to make decisions that benefited the hidden elites. Suddenly, Jade was warned that her life and the lives of her team were in danger. She became the target of surveillance, and her actions were followed by high-tech surveillance systems. The danger became even more tangible when Jade learned that the Astral Project was already in the testing phase, and its impact on society was beginning to manifest. Jade and her team infiltrated a lab where virtual reality technology was being developed to gain access to information and evidence. During their infiltration, something unexpected happened. It turned out that one of the project's leading scientists was a secret agent working for an international human rights organization, and not only knew about the entire plan, but was also helping Jade from the inside. This scientist, Dr. Sophie Lun, had access to key components of the technology and was able to provide information about its most dangerous aspects. Dr. Lund revealed that the Astral Project was designed not only to manipulate public opinion, but also to create a situation in which individuals could be used as puppets in global political and economic games. She also revealed that behind the project was a new, more powerful group that united old and new allies of the secret organization. Unexpectedly, Jade was faced with another shocking discovery. One of the key funders and participants in the Astral Project was a man Jade considered a friend and ally. This man, known as Raymond Shaw, was a vocal supporter of her work and appeared dedicated to the cause. But in reality, Shaw was deeply involved in the project and used his position to covertly advance his own agenda. With time running out, Jade and her team decide to undertake a risky operation to expose the Astral Project and prevent its further spread. They devise a plan to shut down key systems and publish evidence of manipulation using covert channels and international connections. The operation turned out to be extremely dangerous. Jade and her allies had to deal with high-tech security and manipulation aimed at framing them. During the implementation of the plan, there was a surprise attack on their base, and part of the team was captured. These events created even more pressure and the need for an urgent response. Amidst the chaos, Jade and Dr. Lund were able to access the project's main server and expose the manipulations. They leaked all the data to the world's media, causing a new international scandal. Documents confirming the true goals and scale of the Astral Project were released, causing public outrage and prompting urgent measures to stop the technology. The turn of events that followed this revelation had a significant impact on world politics and public consciousness. Investigations continued and new power structures began to form in response to the revelations. Jade and her team, despite all the lost victims and difficulties, were able to take an important step towards preventing global control. Jade's story ended on a note of struggle and victory. Despite difficult trials and tragedies, her efforts showed how determination and courage can change the world. Even when enemies seem invincible, Jade continued her work, drawing attention to human rights issues and technological threats, and her legacy became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice. After successfully exposing the Astral Project, Jade and her team began to realize that their work was far from done. The world was still in a state of tension due to global scandals and concerns about the manipulation of public opinion. Jade continued her fight, but soon faced a new threat that threatened to escalate the situation. At the peak of her work, Jade received a cryptic message from Raymond Shaw. He, who had previously been implicated in the project, now revealed that he had been forced to work under duress. Shaw revealed that behind the Astral Project was an even more sinister organization called ECHO. This plan involved creating a false terrorist threat to manipulate public opinion and distract from the real problems. Shaw provided Jade with information that ECHO was preparing to launch a massive operation that involved fake attacks and threats designed to undermine public trust and increase control over the population. These manipulations were intended to create fear and anxiety, allowing the hidden elites to consolidate their power. Jade began investigating to stop ECHO from being launched. She learned that the project involved sophisticated technology to create fake data and events that could be easily picked up by the media and manipulated. Jade soon realized that her team was once again under surveillance and that there might be spies among her close aides. This forced her to work even more carefully and seek out new allies. Among the new allies was Dr. Sophie Lund, who provided key information about ECHO's inner workings. As Jade and her team investigated, they discovered a shocking truth. One of their old allies, James Hartman, was secretly involved in ECHO. Hartman, a renowned security expert and public figure, had used his influence to conceal his involvement in the project and to mislead those who sought to expose him. The revelation of Hartman and his ties to ECHO was a critical moment. Jade and her team mounted a risky operation to neutralize the threat. They used covert channels and international connections to expose evidence of ECHO's plan, causing an international scandal. Public attention was once again focused on the real issues, and world leaders began taking steps to restore trust and ensure transparency. Jade and her team were recognized for their efforts, but also realized that their work would never be done. They continued to fight for truth and justice, creating new international initiatives to prevent technological abuses and fight corruption. Despite all the trials and losses, Jade remained true to her mission. She continued her work, inspiring others to fight for fairness and justice, and her legacy became a symbol of determination and courage in a world full of threats and manipulation. With the end of Jade and her team's struggle, the world faced a new reality where truth and justice were more valuable than ever. Their story of dogged struggle and determination inspired many and showed that even in the darkest corners, light can be found. The plans of the Astral Project and Echo were exposed, and the international community took a step forward towards a more open and just world. But Jade's story didn't end there. She continued her work, helping to restore trust and protect human rights in an ever-changing world. Her legacy lives on, reminding us of the importance of fighting for truth and justice. Now we are interested to know your opinion about this story. Write in the comments what you think about how the events developed and what emotions the latest events caused you. Also let us know how long you have been watching our channel. It is important for us to know how long we can inspire and inform you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to stay up to date with new exciting stories and important updates. Thanks for being with us and see you in the next video.